So we're just here today to talk about something called the Federal Economic Agenda. So it's a project we've been working on for about 8 months now. And I really just want to give you an overview of the project and then spend a few minutes walking through some of the specific issues that we want to talk about. And then we've got about 25 minutes or so set aside for questions and discussion. That's really what I want to focus on and make sure that we have a good amount of time to do. So really the Mowat, I just want to give you kind of a 10-second overview of the Mowat Center. The Mowat Center is a think tank located at the University of Toronto. We were founded about 5 years ago, and one of our main focus areas is intergovernmental affairs. So how does Ontario fit in with the Federation in Canada? What's our relationship with the federal government, with other provinces? Where are there opportunities to strengthen Ontario's position within the Federation? That's really the genesis of this project in terms of the federal economic agenda. So really we have been working with Charles Sirtwell, the Northern Policy Institute, the Institute for Competitiveness and Prosperity at the University of Toronto, to try and develop a shared set of issues and challenges that are facing Ontario amongst a broad range of economic stakeholders. So we've been working with groups such as the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, AMO, the Association of Municipalities of Ontario, Life Sciences Ontario, so groups representing both industry associations and specific sectors. And we've been doing that over the past 8 months or so. And the idea really behind this has been, how can we articulate a common agenda for Ontario within the Federation? Ontario is really a place that hasn't historically viewed itself as a political entity. We've seen the federal government have strategies for Western Ontario, or for Western Canada, for the Maritimes, for Quebec. But typically speaking, federal governments over the course of many decades now have really kind of taken for granted Ontario's position as a powerful economic engine that's driving forward the rest of Canada. But what we're really seeing in recent years is that there's been a bit of a shift in that area. So what we're trying to do is think about, given the context of we've got a federal election that's going to be happening at the latest by October 2015, what are the opportunities for us to get a broad tent of stakeholders together and say, these are common issues that are facing Ontario. These are issues that the federal political parties, as they go out on the campaign trail, should think about and should be in a position to respond to. So that's really the purpose of this project. Get as many people together as we can to develop a shared set of ideas and recommendations around how Ontario can be best positioned to be a powerful economic actor in Canada and in the world moving forward. So in terms of what the project is about and where we are at with it, we really started off back last summer with some roundtables with some of those industry associations, some of those sector-specific groups, to develop a bit of a shared platform and a discussion paper. And then we released this discussion paper, which hopefully you all have a copy of, or you can grab a copy of, so it looks like this. We released that at the Ontario Economic Summit back in October. And the discussion paper is intended to be relatively short and easy to digest. It really just kind of covers off what this project is all about, and what are some of those key issues and opportunities that Ontario is facing. And as we move forward with this project, we've been consulting with people in different parts of the province, from different industry associations, and saying, do we have it right in this document? Do we have these issues right? Are there other issues that we're missing? What are some of the actual recommendations that you think we can move forward with to develop answers and solutions to some of the problems that are identified in the discussion paper and some of the opportunities? So what we're hoping to do is, over the course of the next 2 to 3 months, is finalize an actual paper coming out of this that'll be easy, short and relatively easy to understand, that we can go out and promote and sell essentially to political parties, to the public, and to the media, so that people have kind of a very accessible piece that they can say, okay, these are some of the key issues that Ontario needs to think about in terms of its economic future. And here's how the federal government particularly can be a strong partner with Ontario as it moves forward along this path. So why does this even matter? Why do we care about Ontario's economic agenda? Why is that something any of you should care about? I mean, I think you could argue that, as I said earlier, that historically Ontario hasn't really had to worry too much about federal attention. We've been a strong and dynamic economy. We've kind of been the engine of Canada's economy for many years. But in the past 10 years or so, we're starting to see some of that shift. Some of the implications of things like globalized trade, the advent of new technologies, the recent financial crisis have really put a lot of pressure on Ontario. Our manufacturing sector has shed 300,000 jobs over the past decade, for example. We're seeing a drastic rise in precarious employment. There's a 33% growth in precarious employment, so people working in the service sectors, food service industries, and things like that. That's the fastest growing sector of our economy in Ontario. Those are precarious, generally lower paid jobs. These aren't the kind of well-paid manufacturing jobs that we had in the past that people could build a career around and spend 30 years doing the same type of job. We're seeing gaps in terms of productivity growth as it relates to our competitors in the US and in Europe. But on the flip side, we are also seeing some opportunities. We're seeing the emergence of some really strong sectors and clusters within Ontario. So the ICT sector in Kitchener-Waterloo, financial services in Toronto and in other parts of the province, for example. So we're at a kind of a bit of a tipping point now, or what we could call a clutch moment, where a lot of things are changing in the external environment, and we have some opportunities, but we're also facing some headwinds and some challenges. And the key point for us really in all of this is the fact that there is really no clearly articulated federal economic agenda or strategy that's actually designed to respond to any of these issues from Ontario's perspective. So our goal here, working with the Northern Policy Institute and the Institute for Competitiveness and Prosperity, is to try and articulate what some of those issues are, and more importantly, try and put forward some suggestions about what a federal strategy might look like. What kinds of issues might a federal strategy consider? What kind of actions might a federal strategy include to help Ontario get back on the path to success and the path to being a leader in Canada? And I should also mention as well that a lot of the issues that we're going to talk about aren't issues that are solely the jurisdiction of the federal government. There are a lot of players who are involved in many of these issues, and we recognize that. But given the context of the forthcoming election this year and the policy window that presents, we thought that this really presents an opportunity to focus on what the federal role is. Many of these issues that I'm going to briefly highlight for you are areas where the federal government has a unique leadership opportunity and role. It has some very unique policy levers to make success happen. So that's kind of why this is focusing more on the federal role than, for example, the provincial government or private sector at this time. So this slide really outlines what those key issue areas are that we've outlined in the discussion here. And these are really for discussion. We're not saying that these are definitely the right set of issues. There are some issues you'll notice, for example, First Nations, Aboriginal issues aren't included here because we kind of have had discussions about that. It might be another category. It might be something that cuts across many of these different issues. But these are the 7 issues that we, through discussions with our partners, have identified as kind of a good starting point, at least, to have discussions with folks such as yourself about as these are areas that might require some further federal action. So what I'm going to do is just very briefly spend kind of a minute or so on each of these and just highlight a couple of points around why some of these things matter and why they're things that the federal government needs to potentially take action on. And again, these are all outlined in further detail in the discussion paper, so I'm just kind of giving you a very quick highlight or two from each of these. So infrastructure funding is one of those issues that, again, the federal government, from a wide variety of commentators have observed that the federal government has really kind of lost its way in terms of funding for infrastructure. Most experts believe that that industrialized nations should maintain about 5% of their GDP should be invested in infrastructure on an annual basis. In Canada, this chart really displays that we've kind of slipped from that 5% level back in the 1960s down to about 3% for most of the 80s and 90s. We've started to move back up again because of stimulus spending in the last 5 years coming out of the recession. But the fear is that this peak that we've seen recently, kind of up at about 4%, is going to go back down. Premier Wynne talked about this yesterday in Ottawa, that 5% is kind of the level that we want to see. I mean, if you look at the figures, the federal government spends about 12% of all investment, or sorry, all infrastructure dollars in Ontario. 88% of infrastructure investment comes from the province or the municipal level of government. So 12% only comes from the federal government. So that, in large part, is a reason for this gap of why we're not up at that 5% level. And that's a big concern if we look at some of the infrastructure challenges in Northern Ontario, the border in Windsor. Those are areas that are in urgent need of investment to not just move us forward, but just not to hold us back. They're kind of major obstacles to economic growth in many parts of the province. This next slide speaks briefly to workforce development. So the idea that Ontario continues to experience higher unemployment rates than many other parts of the country. But while that's the case, we continue to face the fact that the EI system as it's currently designed discriminates against Ontarians and Ontario employees. We have seen in the first 10 years of this century, Ontario paid $20 billion more into the EI system than Ontario workers received back in benefits from EI. So that's a massive redistribution from workers who need EI benefits and the training that's associated with it back to other parts of the country. And that might have made sense when Ontario was booming, but now that Ontario has been facing some difficulties in the past 5 or 6 years, you have to question the logic of a program where Ontario workers are receiving by far the lowest percentage of EI benefits amongst all unemployed workers across the country. I mean, if you look at some of the figures from this past fall, in many communities in Ontario, only about 25, 20%, 30% of workers who are unemployed can actually get EI in Ontario. And that's a little bit shocking, and you have to wonder how that's having long-term scarring impacts on those workers in terms of their ability to get employed again or to retrain themselves for new opportunities. Another area that we've wanted to flag for everyone is this idea of what's Ontario's role as it relates to immigration and attraction of skilled immigrants to Canada? Ontario used to be the predominant and the preferred destination of immigrants from all around the world. People said, we want to come to Ontario, we want to settle in Ontario and make our lives and contribute to the Ontario economy. Over the past 10 years, essentially, we've seen a 33% drop in the number of immigrants coming to Ontario as it relates to the rest of the country. So that's a significant concern. Some of that is the result of federal program decisions. Some of that is the result of economic transfers. But what we're also seeing is the fact that many of those immigrants who are settling in Ontario are experiencing much worse outcomes in terms of social outcomes and economic outcomes than immigrants who had come here in the 80s or in the 70s. So we need to think about what's wrong or what's broken with our immigration system. How can we attract more immigrants, more skilled immigrants to Ontario, to Northern Ontario, and get them to fill some of these jobs that perhaps we have that are lacking. And then trade and investment's another big issue. I mean, when we wrote this discussion paper back in the fall, a lot of the framing around this was around the commodity boom and the fact that our dollar was really high. So obviously we don't have that issue right now in the short term. Things have kind of flipped around on that front. But what we're seeing is that most of Ontario's exports are still going to the U.S. About 4/5 of our exports still go to the U.S. We haven't really diversified. I mean, we're entering into a free trade agreement with the EU. The Trans-Pacific Partnership is opening up new opportunities in Asia. But how can Ontario actually access those markets? We're a little bit landlocked. Do we have the logistics? Do we have the transportation networks necessary to get goods to market in places other than the U.S.? And even when we're talking about the U.S., we have challenges in terms of the border, congestion and delays for trucks trying to cross the border. Only 6% of SMEs in Ontario are actually engaged in export activity. And we also have issues where fewer firms in Ontario as compared to other provinces actually grow from small or medium to larger size firms. So what are some of those issues that we're facing? Is there a role for the federal government to help small and medium enterprises sell their goods more globally and also to grow to the next level of growth and employ more Ontarians and contribute to our GDP? So then we've also got this challenge around innovation. I mean, this is something that a lot of people have talked about. There's been a lot of research written about this. I mean, one of the recent studies that came out of, I think it was the OECD or the World Economic Forum, cited a statistic that labor productivity for Ontario workers is about 3/4 that of a worker in the United States. And that gap has really emerged over the past 20 years or so. So why are workers in Ontario so much less productive than workers in the US or in many parts of Europe? That's a question that we have to think about. Some people would argue that that's a business challenge, that businesses haven't been investing enough in R&D, machinery and equipment, ICT. But is there a role for the federal government to help promote that kind of investment? What kind of policies does the federal government have in place to promote ICT investment by companies? Or are there things that we can do with the tax credit system or SHRED or things like that to move forward? Then we have federal transfer. So this is my boss's favorite topic, but as I've said to other people, something that most people, their eyes completely glaze over when we talk about federal transfer. So I'll keep this very short. But essentially the issue here is, I mentioned infrastructure earlier. Infrastructure is a good example of a major federal transfer contribution to the provinces, where Ontario sees a far lower proportion of infrastructure funding than you would expect. So the new Building Canada Fund that the federal government recently announced. One component of that is a $10 billion fund for provincial territorial infrastructure. Ontario is only receiving 28% of that $10 billion, despite the fact we have 39% of the population in Ontario. And one of the main reasons for that is the federal government decided that a third of that $10 billion, so roughly over $3 billion, was going to be allocated equally to each province. So every province gets $250 million for a part of this fund. So PEI, with 100 and something thousand people, gets exactly the same amount of money for infrastructure from this, a component of this fund as Ontario, with 12 to 13 million inhabitants. So you have to question the logic of that. Does that really make sense from a policy perspective? And if we also look at other federal programs such as equalization or EI, I already mentioned the gap in EI, how much we pay in versus how much we get out in Ontario. All of these things together result in what we call a gap between Ontario's share of federal revenue and Ontario's share of federal spending. So we contribute roughly 39% of our towards the federal revenue, and we only get back about 34% of federal spending in Ontario. So that's a gap of about $11 billion a year. That various programs over the course of time have just evolved to the point where Ontario is getting shortchanged. And again, that didn't necessarily matter as much 15 or 20 years ago when Ontario could afford to kind of help subsidize other parts of the country or afford to shoulder a larger share than its population would dictate. But now that Ontario's economy has been struggling for the last number of years, you have to question the design of programs that lead to an $11 billion gap between what Ontario contributes to the Federation and what we get back in federal spending. So then the last point, this one's a bit of more of a grab bag. This is this idea of targeted sectors, targeted strategies for regions or for specific sectors. So do we need more involvement or investment in FEDNOR to focus on Northern Ontario issues? Do we need a Southwestern Ontario redevelopment strategy given the hard hits that the manufacturing sector in that region, the province, has taken? Are there things the federal government could do to help promote a stronger life sciences sector in the Greater Toronto area? A lot of other jurisdictions have experienced great success by focusing their policies and targeting them through like either a place-based lens, so we're focusing on a particular region, or on a sectoral lens. So we're going to focus on certain sectors and really invest and strategize around how we can make those sectors globally leaders or globally competitive. We haven't really seen that to date by the federal government. There are questions around how we might want to engage with the federal government on either place-based or regional, or sectoral strategies. So that really brings us then to the discussion. So having said all of what I've just said, having read hopefully now or later what we've said in this discussion paper, we really want to kind of get some of your initial thoughts now, and then subsequently you can certainly feel free to email your thoughts to us or to Charles at the Northern Policy Institute. All of this information is on their website, Northern Policy.